I'm going to introduce Executive Director for the Association for Opera in Canada, Christina Loewen. Christina has worked with the opera sector over the past 5 years in the development of a common opera civic impact framework and a digital tool, the Opera Impact Platform. And to simplify the collecting and reporting of impact data, it's a very exciting development for us in the opera field. Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm just going to take a moment and share my screen for my presentation. All right, there we go. So, well, it's a real honor to follow the Senator's remarks around the importance, value, and impact of the arts that they have on our society from coast to coast. And it's a real privilege to be here today to share with you the story of the development of the Opera Civic Impact Framework. This has been a collective impact standard building exercise for the opera sector in Canada, and it was developed, and I'm sharing it today as a model or example of what might be possible in establishing a broader arts impact standard for the arts in Canada. So I want to begin by acknowledging the inspiration for the work we've been doing at AOC around collective impact building. This is the work of Dr. Kate Ruff of the Common Approach to Impact Measurement. The Common Approach is a Canadian innovative effort to create a flexible impact standard or measurement that unites the entire social purpose sector in Canada. And just as full disclosure, I do sit on the board of the Common Approach, but if you've ever heard Dr. Ruff speak, and I get to hear her speak at our board meeting 6 times a year, you will have no doubt heard her say this phrase several times, that standards are communities, not documents. And this is a guiding principle for collective impact and a principle for the work that I follow and that I think that we all need to remember as we form a new community. And it's why today's event is called Building an Arts Impact Community, as opposed to building a standard or a common framework. And I'm going to just take you on a little journey using the Opera Civic Impact Framework of an example of what we might accomplish together. So this is the journey of the development of the opera framework, which I would just call part 1, which was a 5-year journey, very interesting and long journey. And it began back in 2015 when members of the Association for Opera in Canada. We were called AOC, opera.ca back then, and we've recently rebranded. So members voted for a 5-year strategic plan to develop a framework that would help them tell a better story of the impact that they were having in their communities. We followed a very grassroots approach in developing this framework. It was bottom up. We decided we would begin by first defining what constitutes a good civic practice, because we recognize that there's not so good civic practice and we don't want to fall into those traps. We supported the development of these civic impact initiatives. We took part in a bilateral learning group hosted by Opera America, the Civic Impact Learning Group, where 4 Canadian companies joined 8 US companies, and they shared learning across borders of the good work that they were doing in their communities. From that work, a resource was developed called the Guide to Good Civic Practice. Definitely something that was developed for opera companies in the opera sector. But through the development of this learning, opera companies then began to become far more prolific in their civic impact initiatives. They became very active in their communities. We began to work with Meredith Davis of Good Roots Consulting, and through the help of a working group committee, we started to basically follow our opera companies around and understand the work that they were doing and the impact that they wanted to have. And based on the discussions we had with this small working group, we reverse engineered a framework based on the commonalities that existed in the existing practices in the field. And I want to say that this whole process took 5 years, but there was a very strange starting point in our first year. So I have to admit for myself, when the strategic plan was first approved, it was a really terrifying moment for me because I really didn't know anything about evaluation. And I thought, gulp, now I have to create a theory of change or a logic model, or what is that? And one of the first things I did was, I wrote a grant. I wrote a grant to hire some experts to help us to develop this theory of change. And we didn't get the grant. And it was, I would say, the best thing that happened in the strategic plan, because what we ended up was a framework that was grassroots, bottom up, extremely developmental, and shaped by and for its community. So in December 2019, so just a couple months before the pandemic, we announced the Opera Civic Impact Framework. It had 5 impact domains: experience, access, education, community, and truth and reconciliation. And in each one of these impact area themes, we articulated the core outcomes and indicators that we were measuring. And you can see some of those around the circle in the graphic, so you could understand what the specific indicators are, with the exception of truth and reconciliation. Because in this area, this is an area where, as a sector, we decided that it was inappropriate for us to be measuring the impact that we were having in terms of achieving anything in terms of truth and reconciliation, because it's not our place to measure that. And furthermore, we wanted to be guided by Indigenous artists in understanding what constitutes a good civic practice. And so we worked with an Indigenous advisory group with Marion Newman, and Dylan Robinson was a part of that group, Gordon Gerard, Carrie Newman, and I'm forgetting one person, Marion's sister, Ellen, there we go. And they came up with a really wonderful guidance, Indigenous-led guidance on how to develop a good practice. So at the moment, we don't have indicators for that particular area. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what you can find in the Civic Impact Framework. There's a link in this document, and it was also part of the Miro journey. So I encourage you to learn and explore about it on your own. But I do want to move on to what I would say is part 2. So once we had this framework, we were very excited, but we also wanted to make sure that it was a framework that could live and didn't exist as a PDF or a link on a website. It was really important for us that it's something that could be turned into a tool that was actually useful for the opera sector. So we applied to the Canada Council's Digital Strategy Program, and we were awarded a multi-phase grant to digitize it and turn the framework into a tool to collect data and report out on the impact of the opera sector's work in their communities. And we actually got the grant just days before the pandemic struck. So it was that wonderful good news, bad news story. We spent a good almost 3 months recontextualizing the grant in order to make sure that it reflected our new world. And this is what it now looks like. So part 2, the digital impact platform, starts with wanting to make the platform live, and we're doing that through our technology partner, Symmetrica. We added a brand new framework called Recovery. And in the Recovery framework, we are tracking StatsCan data from the performing arts, which is number 7111 if you're a StatsCan data person, and we're mapping that and tracking it against industry aggregates. So we have a subscription to that StatsCan data as well, so we can always see how the performing arts are doing against the larger Canadian industry aggregate, and that's how we're tracking overall recovery data. We added another framework as well called our Resilience Framework, or our Build Back Better framework. And this is a new self-assessment framework for helping the sector develop resilience. Because we, in looking at our own research practices, we were uncomfortable with the notion that we had all the answers and that we could deploy programs intended to have positive impacts in the community, but we ourselves were intact and we did not need to change. We didn't like that idea. And so we wanted to create a device or a framework that would allow us to be implicated in our own research and also be able to change as we are seeking to make changes in our communities. The fourth part of the project is to scale. the impact standard. And so this is where we actually are today. This is the starting ground for that discussion, where part of the goal of the digital strategy grant is to take the opera impact framework and give it to the art sector and say, here it is. How can we make this work or make this fit as an arts impact standard for the broader sector? And the last bit is a bit of artificial intelligence, which I'm calling going global, and it allows us to connect the impact of the arts to community and global outcomes, or to translate, as Senator Bovey called it, artsies into communities. It's like it's a language, and there's technology that we can harness, or digital wizardry, as some of my colleagues call it, that will make those connections much simpler. All right. I just wanted to take a moment to thank and acknowledge the partners on our digital strategy project grant. So this is Symmetrica, our software service provider, Good Roots Consulting, and of course, Mass Culture. So now I want to take you on a demonstration. But before we get into a demonstration of the Opera Impact platform, I just want to let you know that we're about halfway through this project. I'm really excited to show you what we've been able to build. But I also want you to know that this is very much a project in development, and it's not our finished product. So we're currently in the middle of our pilot stage. We're working with 5 opera companies. They have been working on customizing the data collectors and the surveys, and they're making sure that the tool works for them before we go broad and offer it to the larger opera sector, the opera sector members. So for this demo, you're going to be seeing data in our dashboard and our reports, but it's not actually real data. So it's dummy data. So in just a moment, I'm going to switch my share and go into Symmetrica. There, that worked. Okay, so I'm looking at my big screen, by the way, as I'm going to go through this. So when you log on to the Symmetrica platform, there are 3 places you can go. There's the logic model builder, there's the data collector, which is where all the surveys are stored, and then there's reporting and analysis. And this acts very much as a dashboard, pulling in all of the information from the survey collector. I'm going to start with the data collector, because that's where we've been working the most extensively. And I'm going to go, you'll see we have our 3 frameworks there: civic impact, recovery, and resilience. And I'm going to go into civic impact. And in the civic impact framework, we currently have 3 active deployable surveys and 1 annual tracking form. And we're going to be looking at the performance survey. This is the post-performance or event survey. But before I go into that survey, I just want to highlight a unique feature about these surveys, is that they're fully deployable in many different ways. So as a platform user, you would be able to send an email directly from the platform. You could copy the link and you could send it from your own email server. Then we have this one called Enter Manually, which allows remote data capture. So say you're at a festival, or there's an event and you have volunteers roaming around with tablets. They can load the survey onto their tablets, and as volunteers they can walk around and they can survey members, and all of that information goes directly into the platform. And that can also be set up as standalone tablets as well. So if you want to set up a station for less distancing, or more social distancing, I should say. So for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to use the Enter Manually link. And this opens up the performance survey. And this is a series of questions that is fully customizable, and any Opera user can cherry pick their way through this performance survey, and they can choose the questions that are most relevant to the kind of performance or event that they're measuring. And this survey starts out very much like any event survey or post-performance survey. So we ask whether or not it's the first time someone is attending the performance, how many times they've attended in the past, how much they enjoyed the performance. There's some opportunities for some open-ended questions about what they liked the most. Some specific questions related to opera, like did you attend the pre-show talk? Did the talk allow a greater appreciation for the performance? And then we get into the next page and we start getting at some different questions. So, and now we start getting into some of the questions that are reflected in our civic impact framework related to the performance. So some of these questions, some examples of these questions are, the performance left me feeling that opera is more relevant today than I had originally thought. At times, I was entirely captivated by the performance. The performance unlocked strong emotional reactions. I feel more proud of my culture or my community as a result of attending this event. The performance or event gave me a new understanding for people who are different from me or for a culture other than my own. I feel more connected to others in my community who are different than me because of attending this event. The performance motivated me to engage in dialogue or action about a topic that was covered. These are things that the arts can do. And then the atmosphere was warm, open, inviting. And let's see what happens when I move to the next screen. Can you see the next screen? Yes, okay. And then we have an entire set of digital questions, because of course we all went digital during the first year of the pandemic, and we're just going probably into a hybrid season. So we have some ways of tracking the digital experience. And then we finish up with some demographic questions around age range, gender identity, where you're born, level of education, ability, and disability. So that's just a quick walkthrough of the performance survey, and I'm going to stop that share. I'm going to close that, and I'm going to do another share and return to the Symmetrica dashboard. And from here, I'm going to go into reports and analysis. So we're going to imagine that we took that survey and we deployed it, and people are actively filling out that survey right now. And by going to the reports and analysis tab, and I'm going to go straight to community because I know that many of those questions were linked to indicators in the community theme. So let me go there first. And again, this is a sample dashboard. We still have not finalized what the dashboard will look like. But, for example, you can now see the results of that survey. So here, 36% felt opera is more relevant to today than they had thought. 20% developed a new understanding for people who are different. 39% felt more proud of their culture or community. This tracking some great captivation statistics here. So the show was good, captured people's attention. People strongly felt connected to those different in their community. They agreed, 31% agreed that they felt motivated to engage in dialogue. So, right away, you can see that this is a place where you can not only see your data, but you can actually pull out some really useful and meaningful statistics that can populate a civic impact report. All right, and then from here, I'm just going to actually just quickly show you the recovery framework. Right now, because we're doing some updates, the only thing we can see is employment statistics. But because I mentioned it, I would just like everyone to be able to see what the curve looks like when we're tracking the performing arts. So the performing arts is, in this is largely the purple line, so obviously we can see when the pandemic happened because everything goes down in March. And this sort of shows you the curve of the performing arts versus the blue line, which is the industrial aggregate. And it's very interesting to see that throughout all of these employment statistics, the arts sector significantly lags behind the industrial aggregates. And here there's a bit of a coming together, but that's just actually missing data. All right, so I'm going to stop this share. And I'm going to go into my next share, back to my presentation. Oops. There we go. Great. So this is what the platform currently looks like. We anticipate it's going to be ready for prime time in November. And as per our grant requirements of openness, accessibility, and shared learning, we're making it available to the broader art sector to use as is, to modify, to build upon, to just take it out of the box and run with it. But when it's ready, we think of this as being a one-stop arts evaluation dream come true. It's easy, it will be tested, it's got surveys and dashboards, it's going to make you and your staff look like evaluation superstars. You're going to have annual reports that just leap off the page, and you're going to be able to connect it to, your community outcomes, as well as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So all of it's easily customizable to any art form. However, one of the things we can't avoid is that it was made by and for the opera sector. And this actually is one of the key value propositions for the opera sector and opera users of the platform. And it's always been one of our key principles, is that our framework is shaped by its users, and in this case, the opera sector. So it's never been a top-down process. It's always been grassroots. Form has always followed function, and it's favored process first and product last. And so my question to you, and one which I hopefully we will find partially answered over the course of our action table work, is if this framework was built for opera, what might a common arts impact standard shaped by this community look like? Does it look like the opera framework with a few tweaks made to it? Is it something that's pared down to some minimum common denominator? Does it strike its own path altogether and start from scratch based on those who form the arts impact community and the assortment of frameworks that we all bring to this table? And so this is what we're here today to start a conversation around: creating an impact standard for the arts by first building a community. But before we do so, we need to talk about the elephant in the room: standards. So I want to acknowledge that people chafe at this word. People don't like the notion of standards and standardization. They feel at best that it's a compromise, at worst that it's a dangerous and evil path to oppression and groupthink and totalitarianism and all kinds of awful things. But let's explore the world of standards together for a moment. First of all, everyone is doing it. And I don't say that as a means to stimulate FOMO, but really to understand what is the usefulness of standards. What are some common data measurement standards in use today? So I wanted to highlight one of the ones that most of us would be really familiar with would be the GAP, the generally accepted accounting principles. Another common standard in effect right now is ESG standards for investors around corporate responsibility. And ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance standards. This standard actually doesn't exist right now, but there's a lot of conversation, and it's in the process of being built. Then there are the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015, provided a shared blueprint for peace, prosperity, and people and the planet for now and into the future. And at its heart are these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are an urgent call for action by all countries, developed and developing, in a global partnership. So that's a lot of countries able to come together to create a standard. And then the last one is the common approach to impact measurement. And this is the effort I was telling you about of seeking to align the impact of all the social purpose sectors in Canada. And it's important to note that in the development of all these standards, they faced a lot of criticism and scrutiny and pushback over standardization, but the standards prevailed. So I would say that if you fall into the camp of those rejecting the idea of standardization, you're in good company. So why an arts standard? I'm just going to talk through some of these. I would say that one of the biggest reasons for having an art standard is because we exist for social good. We're a part of the social contract, yet we lack a common language or evidence base to describe the good that we bring to communities. And describing that good should be much easier than it is now. And I always find myself tongue-tied if I try to talk about the poetry and the beautiful, the wonderful way that the senator can talk about the arts. She talks about it poetically, but then she also can talk about it economically. So she's got two really strong, powerful tools at her disposal, but there's more. And I'm inspired by the words that Simone Brode delivered when he began as the director of the Canada Council for the Arts. He said that he wants to get arts a seat at the table where important issues of the day are being discussed. But more than getting the seat, once we sit there, we have to show that we have something to contribute beyond our understandable preoccupations with producing art. And I think that a standard will help us do just that. An art standard can align and hasten change. Right now, there is an urgency to the world's most complex social issues. So think climate change, inequality, anti-racism. We need action on these fronts, and we need them now. And comparably, the arts are a rather small sector, so we have an opportunity to model some of these changes. The time is right for an arts standard. The pandemic has inspired a new era of collaboration and cooperation amongst sectors and partners to work together to solve these tough issues. An art standard can enable comparisons and connections across different sectors and across geographies. And an art standard can enable technology to make those connections. So this was the artificial intelligence I was telling you about that is actually already enabled within the Common Approach to connect to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we actually only need to connect to the Common Approach, and that will then open up the arts to a world of impact alignment. And the last thing is that the arts can create opportunities to connect with the interests of investors and donors seeking more than a tax receipt or a return on investment. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, and we certainly heard Senator Bobie talk about that as well. So what are some of the consequences of having no standard? Well, some of these might be a little obvious. Change is slower. Impact is fragmented. We have disconnected efforts. We're ineffective in contributing to wide-scale change. Change is inefficient, resulting in wasted time, money, duplication of efforts, challenging already stretched resources, and an inability to harness adoption of wide-scale evaluative capacity for every level of the arts sector. There's also a danger of loss of equity in evaluative capacity, whereas only those with the time, specialized knowledge, and resources can measure their impact. Then there's those missed opportunities. So some of you may have joined some speaking moments where Mark Carney, who's now back in Canada, he's heading up Brookfield's ESG investment, and he's written a book. And in his new role, he estimates that there's currently $1 trillion in private capital seeking disclosure. These are investors seeking more than a financial return on investment. These are investors that want to make sure that their money is invested ethically. Now, imagine the bleed over effects into philanthropy if we cannot collectively demonstrate the social impact of private donations to the arts. And maybe worst of all, as a result of not being able to demonstrate a collective social good, we become marginalized, and the arts are seen as a nicety rather than a necessity to our communities. Won't a standard compromise the unique nature of my art? No, not at all. A standard is actually just a loose grouping. It's a good enough approach with ample room for creativity, uniqueness, and novelty. And again, I'm going to refer back to the Common Approach when they do their grouping exercise. They refer to something they call the collective shrug. So they start loosely grouping things together and they say, does this go there? And they say, yes, that's good enough, right? And they all just sort of shrug and say, that'll do. So we're not looking for perfection, we're looking for those loose groupings. I like to think about it as a core. So for example, across the internet, there's thousands, millions of beautiful, creative, unique websites on the internet, but they're all different. And at their core, they run on WordPress or Drupal or some other CMS, but the core has the capacity for add-ons to be customized and built around it. But perhaps the simplest way to look at a standard is that it's a starting place. And so I want to end where we began with this quote, that standards are communities, not documents. This is the starting place. You are here. So let's talk about building that community. Thank you.